I'm thrilled that you are joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the globe you're dialing in from. I am thrilled to be in the company of a pioneer. We have Dr. Mirea Raaijmakers with us today. Mirea, you can turn on your webcam and greet everyone. In a second, we will be starting a conversation. Let me introduce her very briefly and then let you, Mirea, to speak a little more about yourself. She's a doctor in behavioral science, and I said pioneer because she was the first psychologist to ever appointed by a central bank to use a specific skill set of the more human side, right, in supervision. And she has worked with regulators across the globe. Without further ado, let me just introduce you, one of our latest and greatest additions to the Axialent team. She recently joined us as associate partner in this wonderful theme of behavioral risk management.
Thank you, Anabel, and welcome to everybody, of course, who's now attending and maybe checking out the webinar at a later moment.
That's right. So without further ado, let me just explain how we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to be asking Mirea some questions. Please feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A. We will have around 15 minutes at the end of this webinar for your questions. So we really welcome this to be a dialogue, a conversation, and maybe it's the first of a series, okay? Who knows? So let's start by maybe getting everybody to be on the same page about what we're talking about in this webinar today. So Mirea, can you just explain, both for those who already know about this topic and those who are probably new, and especially new in this context of culture, right? Can you explain the concept of behavioral risk management and why it's becoming increasingly relevant in the business world today?
Yes, of course, Anabel, and well, let's start at the beginning, right? Behavioral risk management is about human behavior, and I think you know, and probably everybody in this webinar and later on also know that human behavior can bring us above and beyond, right, in organizations. In terms of performance, the sky is the limit. In incredible innovations that people have created, the deep connection that people can feel when they're in an organization. So there's a lot to be proud of and celebrate when we think about human behavior in organizations. But there's also another side to human behavior. Human behavior can also get us into trouble, right? If we think about enormous inefficiencies in our organization that have to do with people not understanding each other, not trusting each other, not sharing information, the right information or in time, the enormous workarounds that we have, people cutting corners, people not trusting each other, people going for their own interests and forgetting about the more overarching interest. We have that in our organizations as well. And I would say behavioral risk is about especially that side of the organization, or at least as a starting point, to find out, what does the organization look like when it comes down to behavior that might get us into trouble or is already getting us into trouble. And then behavioral risk management is I would say, a very, it has the traditional steps of a risk management approach, namely identifying risks, assessing them, and then, of course, doing something about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's really a fascinating field, because that's really the unknown. So the human root cause, right, of those risks. So you've been in this field for 12 years now, right, Mirea? So how has the landscape of behavioral risk management evolved over the years?
Well, it has absolutely evolved. If I think back about starting at the Dutch Central Bank, and as you said, there weren't there weren't psychologists or behavioral scientists who had the specific assignment to use that skill set in supervision. So I remember there was quite some reluctance and cynicism around this. We even had here in the Netherlands, it was on the 8 o'clock news that, you know, the Dutch Central Bank was now bringing in psychologists in their supervision. And there were a couple of lawyers after that section who were commenting on that. There was quite high standing, I would say, lawyers, and they thought, you know, the DNB, the Dutch Central Bank had gone, you know, had completely lost it. And yeah, so there were so there was absolutely cynicism in the organization, at the financial industry as well. But I think there was also absolutely a awareness that, you know, after the financial crisis, solely looking at you know, the financial part of organizations, their solvability and their liquidity, or looking at the structures and the controls and the processes that were in place, you know, it's not enough, right? Mm-hmm. And by simply just stating and requiring more and more in terms of rules and regulations, there was also a realization this is not going to keep us from another financial crisis. So I still believe the Dutch Central Bank has made a very brave decision there in realizing we need to bring in different expertise, right? We need to bring in a different perspective on organizations if we try to understand this and address this, assess this, and do something about this. So, and I think ever since a lot of supervisors around the world have reached out to the Dutch Central Bank and, of course, asked them, you know, can you help us, and how can we embed this in our supervisory approach? And I think, you know, banks have followed suit after a couple of years as well. After 6.5 years, I joined ING Bank, where I built a capability that on the one hand did the diagnostics that the Dutch Central Bank did as well, but in a bank you also have a responsibility to help the organization change and improve and transform. So that was also part of the responsibility of that capability that I led. And ever since, you see that there are more and more capabilities within the financial industry, but I also think beyond that, that focus on, you know, helping the organization from a behavioral perspective, from a thinking in terms of behavior and culture, if you're thinking about changing things.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the people in the audience who know Axialent, yeah. They must be thinking, you know, what does behavioral risk management have to do with culture? And of course, as culture experts, we know it's got everything to do. But what would you say is the connection? Why are you here speaking in an Axialent webinar about behavioral risk management? How does that connect?
Yeah, well, you know, after I think there's a couple of touch points. And after building a capability at the supervisor, building a capability like that at a bank, and seeing how, you know, how important nowadays it is that you're able as an organization to drive the behavior and the culture in your organization. And transformation, I would say, is like a constant thing, right? We say this all the time, but it's also especially when we talk about behavior and culture change. And so, as I said, after being a supervisor in a bank, it was a bit of a personal mission that I thought I would like to do this, but, you know, add this value, be able to add this value that I'm so convinced of, right, which is so important for a lot of organizations, to bring that, right, to as many industries as possible. And of course, Axialent has feet on the ground everywhere, right? So that's a perfect combination. But I think it's also a perfect combination because we think alike on, if we talk about the views and the principles and how you work on behavior and culture. And I think that's crucial as well, right? So there was, well, I can say like an instant kind of connection there on a deeper level that I think, well, at least makes me enjoy this tremendously, right? And it makes me so convinced that we have something to tell the world on what we do. Yeah, and this is that iceberg. Here it is, right? I think the iceberg, it helps to explain a little bit more on that view, right? Where we, of course, think alike, and which we also developed through our common view on behavioral risk management, right? And the iceberg is such a great metaphor to explain how culture works in organizations. You know, the tip of the iceberg is what we all can see, right? It's tangible, it's observable, it's measurable, it's what you can see, it's what you can hear. And this is about results, it's about behaviors, and you know, that's the tip of the iceberg. But the thing is about organization that I think the majority of organizations and a pitfall of a lot of organizations is that they focus on the tip of the iceberg. They build a complete system of processes and controls around that, and they think that's it. And that's a pitfall because there's so much more underneath the waterline, which you need to understand and manage because it impacts what's going on above the waterline. And so underneath that waterline is behavioral patterns, it's habits that people have, it's group dynamics, it's sentiments, it's beliefs that people have around how does the world work, who can I trust, who and not, and you know, is there competition between us, or do we collaborate? So there's a lot going on underneath that waterline, and understanding culture means you need to dig in, right? And you need to deep dive into that underneath that waterline. And then I would say there are two sides, as I just mentioned as well, right? There's the bright side of organizational culture, which is, you know, a very good place to be, as I said, right? It's where risks are taken in a very balanced way, and we are efficient, and we are in control, and you know, there's trust and integrity. But then there's also this other side of culture that is also part of our approach, I would say, to behavioral risk management, of course, which is, yeah, that's the darker side, right? It's where I just said the inconsistencies are, the inefficiencies, the distrust, that's where the sharks are, right? And I think the question is not so much, you know, do we as an organization, do organizations have a dark side? I think every organization has a dark side. Every organization also has bright sides, right? And I think true and honest management is about, and leadership is about understanding both sides, understanding what's going on and doing something about it when it's necessary, and then that, you know, being able to deep dive into underneath that waterline, and also swimming to the areas where the sharks are absolutely part of leadership, you know, nowadays in this fast changing world.
Yes, this is familiar territory for sure. This is where we started to click, right, Mirea?
Yeah.
Where
yeah.
It's not enough to just change the behaviors, right? You know, go to the brighter side, you know, take some balanced risks, and like, okay, if you do not shift the mindsets that are underlying why you're taking risks in an inconsistent way, it's very hard to do that shift. You don't just do it, right? You need to work on the underlying beliefs, the mindsets, and that for sure is, you know, where we at Axialent have a lot of track record working with leaders, leadership teams, and organizations in those. So if I were new in this field of behavioral risk management, where do you advise, you know, people to start? And for those of the audience or who are watching this recording who already have some leeway into the world of behavioral risk management, where would you recommend them to start? So, because it's like a lot, right, Mirea?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think here again, the iceberg can be very helpful, right? So if you don't have a lot of experience, or you don't bring the deep expertise, right, that is necessary to deep dive and fully get a full picture of everything that's going on underneath the waterline, you know, the tip of the iceberg is a very good place to start, right? So zooming in on you know, the results and the behaviors that are tangible, right? So there's a lot of information already present in organizations, and it would be worthwhile to look at that information from a behavioral point of view, I would say, right? So think about what are some key behaviors that people really need to be able to do every day in order to realize a strategy, right? What's really key? And then take those behaviors and use them as a lens to look at the existing metrics that you already have. And it could be either information or data coming from compliance, or from consumer information. It could be HR, it could be your audit function, or and business information, of course. And then try to connect the dots there. You know, do I see any patterns in terms of those metrics and those outcomes that are already tangible and for me, right, available? Do I see any outliers? Is there, you know, are there maybe ways already in the information that I have that I can keep track of these behaviors for a while? Do I need additional information? So I think that's a very good starting point. And maybe, you know, it's also worthwhile to interview a couple of senior leaders around those key behaviors and what is it they see, right? If we talk about these behaviors, are there certain areas they're concerned about, or are there areas, you know, that are really an example in this for these behaviors? So try to get a picture based on the information that's already there, or start asking questions with people who have a view on this. And then for the people who are, I would say, more are doing this for a longer time or more engaged into this, then I think it's a natural next step is that you want to dig in a little bit deeper and dive underneath that waterline and find out what's driving those behaviors, right? What's triggering those the behaviors, you know, the behaviors that are desirable, but also especially, of course, the behaviors that are undesirable or maybe even riskful. You know, what's keeping them alive, and what's, you know, what are the reasons that we continue to keep doing certain behaviors when we know they're not helping us, or they're not contributing to realizing the strategy.
So what I'm hearing you say, at a beginner level, so to speak, let's dive a little below the waterline, and there's already something we can do at that level, but probably changing the lens through which are reading the data that we already have. I'm sure businesses and people in the audience can relate to having a wealth of data. But as we say in most of our workshops with leaders, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So some things might emerge, patterns might emerge that we weren't just looking through the lens of behavioral risk management. So I hear that. And for the more let's say versed in doing that already, dive deeper. There's always a double click to do, but it's murky down there. It's scary, I guess. Mirea, right? And I can imagine that exposing the dark side is not nice. You know, that people will be reluctant to be found at fault. You know, that's a human reaction. So I can imagine that you need to go very well prepared, very well backed, with a lot of data, but not just data, make sense of the data. I guess you need leadership involvement as well. And in your experience, how do you get leaders involved in this? There's just no way, they cannot shy away.
No, it's crucial, right? So I would say it's absolutely a key condition if you start doing this work, that you have backup, right? And because people do experience this as up close and personal, and they feel vulnerable in a way, of course, if you're zooming in on this.
I would.
Yeah, absolutely. So and I would too, right? And so I think what's important is that there's a need, of course, in the organization, and preferably a strategic need, right? So is there something in the organization that's keeping the senior leaders awake at night, so to speak, right? Something they can't really put their finger on, but they, you know, talking about the inefficiencies, talking about people not being able to deliver on time or with good quality, not being able to realize a strategy, being sidetracked, you know, those kind of issues in an organization that really lead to strategic pain. I think, you know, those are ideal conditions, so to speak, to say, look, we need to dig in deeper. We need to better understand this. And it could also very well be another example is that you have an organization who is working right on culture in already with a, you know, in a substantial way, with a lot of different activities, with an integrated approach, and that has senior leadership, and who wants to take a next step and realizes, you know, we've made the first steps, right? But we want to dig in deeper. We want to do this on a more existential level in our organization, which also means we have to understand, you know, what's underneath that waterline anyway. So it can either be, it can be that you are faced with certain issues in an organization, but it could also be that you want to take your development as an organization further, right? And that it's not necessarily because there's a huge issue, but because, well, you want to develop and mature, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, we're receiving some questions from the audience. Thank you for sparking their curiosity here. Let me just interject for a second and pause my own questions for the end. Here's someone asking, how do you connect behavioral risk management with safety in industrial firms, for instance?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, and I would say very there's absolutely a connection there, right? So if we think about safety, and I think the depending on the industries, you know, in the banking industry, I would say they would call this a risk culture instead of a safety culture, where you see in other industries. And there is a close link. So I would say if we talk about safety culture or risk culture, we're talking about, this is a desired state, right? We're talking about the desired behaviors that we want to see, that are essential and crucial to our organization, because in the work that we do, we need to keep you know, our people and employees safe. We have to make sure that, you know, this is the products that we're producing are also safe for our customers. In banking, it's important, right, to have a sound risk culture, meaning you're aware of risks, you're identifying your risks, you're escalating them when you're required to. But this is all about the desired state, the desired behavior that we want to see. Mm-hmm. And behavioral risk management can be very helpful in developing yourself towards that desired state, because it gives you insight into, you know, what's keeping me from that desired state, what's keeping me from that safety culture that I need. What are the behavioral and cultural root causes that undermine this organization from doing the things that we want to do, right? And how we want to behave.
Right, because it sounds like rationally or logically, it's a no-brainer. We all want safety, but why do we have those behaviors that are getting in the way of a safety culture? And that's where behavioral risk management makes you double click, right, on the beliefs and the mindsets that are making people display habits that are counterintuitive to the safety culture, right? So it becomes more explicit. I heard you say at the beginning, you know, and a client of mine uses this phrase as his mantra: let's make the implicit explicit.
Yeah,
in a way, right? To really tackle
absolutely.
it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's another person in the audience who says, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mirea. And could you share any insights on some best practices while explaining behavioral assessment methodologies, which are often perceived to be subjective? I don't know. That's an opinion, I guess, to senior executives. Or maybe it's a voice of experience, you know, that they find that a cynicism that you probably encountered at the beginning of your career. And any broad comments on obtaining buy-in on approaches to assessment?
Yeah. Well, on the notes as an example, you know, maybe I'll just stay very close to home and talk a little bit about the time when I was at ING. Right, so I started at ING without disclosing any information, of course, right? But what I can share, when I started at ING, when I was appointed, I think 3 weeks later, it became clear that ING had to settle with the Dutch government for 800 million euros because it had shortcomings in their anti-money laundering processes. So this was a huge blow for the organization, and it was my assignment to basically find out, you know, what happened there in terms of behavior and behavioral patterns and mindsets that led to this enormous amount of money that had to be paid. And I think, you know, the value that it added there at ING is that it opened up, right, this dark side of the iceberg, right, that area where those sharks swim, right, that all that information about how people behave that is implicit, it opened that, right, for senior management, for senior leaders, but also for every, you know, a lot of employees in the organization, whom I have to say, you know, I absolutely have experience with pushback in organizations, but it is hardly from the people on the work floor, right? Because they think, wow, now we have somebody who just says what it's like, right? This is what the real life is, right? And so I think it showed how much value it can add if you add this perspective to, if you talk about ING, right, they had an enormous change program in place to structurally change a lot of processes, of course, and technologies and tools and strategy around the whole in the AML area. So behavioral risk management wasn't the only thing that was done. Let me be very clear, right? It's not a golden bullet, but it added a lot of value to the organization because their understanding about what was going on, this perspective just opened up a part of the organization that wasn't available in the management information, that wasn't available for the people who were working so absolutely hard to improve all those processes, right? So if we're talking about you know, dynamics between people, collaboration between people, differences in social statuses between groups, that was impacting collaboration and sharing of information, and clarity on roles and responsibilities. So I think ING is absolutely an example of how to make use of a capability like this, combine that with everything else that you're doing, and drive improvement in performance and in integrity and reputation.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's an absolute fantastic success story. I mean, I'm a sucker for success stories because, you know, the tales of the big bad wolf, you know, we're really served that very often. But when there is actually a story where you can see how it has evolved and it has changed, it's really helpful to learn from those as well, right?
Yeah.
But there is this part of the big bad wolf, right? There are pitfalls. You mentioned before that sometimes the way to address those behavioral risks is through more compliance, you know, maybe requiring more controls. I don't know. That really is not the point. The point is people to understand how they can become the players, right? And become protagonists of their own change and taking accountability in a way. So how do you avoid the pitfalls of saying, nah, we're not going to do this. This is too complicated. This is too deep, too profound. How do you overcome those pitfalls, Mirea?
Well, I'll combine it with, because I realized, you know, the question from the audience was also about subjectiveness, right? And in assessing,
how do you assess risk? You know,
yeah.
So I guess
Yeah.
that could be a pitfall, that
yeah.
you are perceived, right, as being, you know, a policing them rather than helping them uncover what would bring them to a healthy risk culture.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely a pitfall, right? That you're just an extension of the compliance police who's telling them, you know, what they're not doing right. So in that sense, you know, where you position the capability and who's supporting you in the exco or board of an organization is important. And I think it's also important that you position this as, you know, we try to understand and find out, but it's also when we talk to people, it's confidential, right? So there's you need to have some kind of independency around doing this kind of assessment, that you're able to that information that you're gathering, to keep that, right? And then report, of course, on the patterns that you see, not on individuals. So this is something that I've always made very clear. This is not about chasing individuals and individual behavior. No, it's about group behavior.
Mm-hmm.
and about what you do together.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's absolutely the culture angle. I think what's also important too, because the notion of subjectivity is absolutely something that is a frame that's being used very easily, right, when we talk about behavior and culture and assessing behavior and culture. So I think it's important that you make sure that you do this in a systematic way, right? So you use different kind of methods and sources of information. So you're gathering your information that's on paper, but you're absolutely also doing interviews with people, asking them about the behaviors and about the unwritten rules and the social norms in the organization. Make sure that you talk to enough people so that you're able to pick up a pattern that's there, and you're not just, you know, digging into incidental behavior. You have to do observations. You need to do focus groups. So and I think so. On the one hand, you need to have a systematic way in collecting your information. You also need to have a systematic way in analyzing that information. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, So how do you treat that data? How do you also, as a assessment team, right, make sure that you have ways of working that eliminate as much as possible the pitfall of groupthink, right? And so I think this systematic side to this approach is also very important. And yes, of course, if you're talking to people and you're asking them, how do you perceive, right, how people behave? Perception is absolutely subjective. And then it's important to make sure that you gather, you know, enough perceptions. But on the other hand, the reality of life is also that perceptions drive people's behavior, right? So there are absolutely ways that you can tackle the pitfall of subjectivity. Yeah.
But what I'm hearing from you, Mirea, is like not just overcome that with all this systematic way of gathering and analyzing data, multiple sources. I heard you name like at least a handful of multiple ways of collecting data, but also how do you code that data? How do you make sense of that data? And that, you know, that's really very important to have that expertise. This, I fear, is not for the faint of heart. Now, the thing is that with all this, sometimes it's also important to, I'm hearing you say between the lines, to just, it's a matter of fact that it is subjective. There is subjectivity. Like subjectivity 0 is not the goal in all this. It's really like, okay, let's embrace that there is perception involved in behavioral risk management, right? And let's make the most of it, knowing that it's human behavior and there is subjectivity. So it's not like our mission to just eliminate subjectivity altogether, but be able to make sense of it in a way that is not biased, that is systematic, and that can give a solid foundation to the decisions to be made, right? So that's such an interesting field where culture and behavioral risk management intersects. There's another question that's coming in. What is your view of an honest mistake which might lead to a significant regulatory issue, or the loss of lives in aviation? Oh, wow, this is very specific. Okay. Is an honest mistake acceptable?
Well, I can say, for example, what happened at ING, there was no bad intent behind that. So I consider the 800 million euros coming from honest mistakes that people made, just very human mistakes. And you know, people are not perfect. We are not perfect, right? And we make mistakes, but if it's on a scale, like for example, a bank like ING, and there are other banks, right? But if it's on such a scale, in such a fundamental process as AML, right, where your customer need to be identified, and you have to make sure that criminals are not using your bank accounts. You know, I can at least say for you know, yes, it's, I think a lot of things that go wrong have to do with human mistakes, and there are absolutely examples of bad intentions, of crossing the line, which I think you have to be very clear about that. That is absolutely not acceptable, right? I think a lot of organizations fall into the mistake of not being clear around that, of accepting non-acceptable behavior. But if it comes down to human mistakes, yeah, I think, you know, you have to, I think the obligation is that you find out, you know, really find out what happened. And then I think with a lot of individual behavior that you see, there's also a connection to the culture in an organization. So the social system in the organization that's, you know, puts a social norm out there that people have to adhere to. and that there's, you know, social reward and social rejection if you don't. So it's much more, I think, you know, looking with this lens of behavioral risk to those kind of examples also helps you to understand, right? And again, if it's non-acceptable behavior, then be very clear about that. Mm-hmm. But I think the majority of the behavior has a much more complex story to it, mm-hmm. Which I think for organizations is key to find out, because they have to continue with the organization. They have to move on. They have to keep the organization alive.
Yes. Yes, I've encountered this many times before when working on corporate culture, right? That there are mixed messages, there are conflicting messages of what's expected of you to be part of this organization. So on the one hand, you know, like zero tolerance, for instance, you know, to accidents in a safety environment, but at the same time, there is no consequence if you lower your guard, right? So I'm hearing you say consequences, you know, you have to be clear about what's non-negotiable in that respect. So this is absolutely key. And the honest mistake thing, from my own personal perspective, and also, well, my professional experience tells me that there's a very big difference between intent and impact. Yeah. So I'm hearing you say, like, be very, very clear about what is not acceptable behavior, right? Because it doesn't really matter whether it's an honest mistake. If regardless of your intent, if the impact, right, is to the whole, then you have to be very serious about it and take matters, you know, equally seriously. So yeah, thank you for combining, right, one more time, behavioral risk with culture, because culture in a way is how people are expected to behave, right, the norms in order to be part of that organization. So 45 minutes, we promised that there would be a Q&A session, although there already have been some questions in the audience. So thank you very much for that. We can continue having those questions in a minute. But just to wrap up, is there something that you would, you know, kind of offer to the audience as a wrapping up in a tidy bow, all right, with regards to how to bring a healthy risk culture, right, to life? So what would that be, Mirea? You already spoke about the pitfalls, overcoming them. You spoke about a nice success story in your firsthand experience. But what would be that little gift at the end for our audience before we continue with our questions?
Well, I would absolutely embrace and bring that dark side to light, right? So make that implicit more explicit. So I think it's scary, of course, right? And it isn't always fun, but I think it's in the end, it's you become so much more resilient and sustainable to deal with life and with everything that's going on in the world. So yeah, absolutely invest in you know, diving into that. Go look for the sharks in the water.
Great. All right, so Q&A, folks. Q&A is officially starting. Get your questions in, and we'll see how much time we have and we'll tackle as much as we can. So, Mirea, what would be your advice to handle a narcissist? Oh, wow, I really love these questions. A narcissist in management positions, of course, someone in power here, who prevents applying behavioral risk management. Oh, wow. I think they're asking the psychologist in you.
Well, the thing is about narcissists is always, I think these are the most hard to recognize, right? Which is part of this disorder. But I think the interesting thing, because you know, this was actually when I started at the Dutch Central Bank, I think this was the most used frame, right? The dominant CEO. the narcissistic CEO. That's the big problem we're having in the financial industry. And I think, you know, what we try to do with our approach, because yes, of course, I've come across quite some dominant CEOs. I think, you know, a level of dominancy is required if you're a leader. But narcissism is a total different, is on the extreme side, right? We're talking about a disorder, but I think what's important to realize is that if you have a too dominant leader, a narcissistic leader, there's also a team around him, right? There's people around them. There's a group around them, and there are dynamics in their group that you have to find out as well, because that will probably also establish, right, and approve that leader also in behaviors. So it's never, so dealing with a narcissistic leader or egocentric leader, it's very easy to think, well, let's just get rid of them and continue. But the thing is that, you know, you have to find out about the dynamic of the rest of the board, the dynamic with other stakeholders, because they are influencing what's going on as well. So maybe it's not just a matter of a leader doing something about the leader, it's also doing something about the social system with its leader.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's not the solo narcissist that we're talking about most of the times. It's if you have a leadership team, right? And you have group dynamics that is feeding into that, you know, those narcissistic behaviors and tolerating or even accepting and promoting it, right? Because those are the messages that people receive. A narcissist was promoted to be, you know, in that management position. So look at your culture, look at your systems. That's great. There's another question. How do you measure or diagnose risk culture in an organization? Yeah. Well, I think this is topic for another webinar in the series, maybe, but maybe a short answer would be beneficial for this member of the audience.
Yeah, I think, well, you know, first of all, it's important to define risk culture, right? So what, you know, what are the different layers there in risk culture? What are the behaviors? What are some of the mindset and attitudes that, you know, are also part of your desired state, right? What you want to be, where you want to go. And then again, I think it's important to understand where you are now in terms of you know, what is it we're already doing that we want to keep doing, and what are the behaviors and the patterns that we should take a closer look at and maybe stop doing or change doing. Yeah, that's part of risk culture as well.
Okay. Many organizations may unintentionally foster a culture of avoidance, right, when it comes to risk. It's like you just want to do the right thing, but unintentionally you cause avoidance, and that's not good for business. And you said that at the beginning of this webinar. What are some signs of this, and how can companies address those?
Well, I think if we talk about avoidance, and I think, you know, in such a turbulent world that we are, avoiding risks or staying in the safe zone, right, is behavior that we see quite a lot, I would say. So, and I think it, you know, if we bring it back to Darwin and his, you know, how people respond to stress, right, and threat in their lives. People respond either by fighting, by flighting, or freezing. And I think, you know, avoidance and avoiding risks in this turbulent world, that's, you know, setting things upside down. Avoidance is a coping mechanism, right? A coping strategy of a lot of organizations who feel or people in organizations who feel overwhelmed, who feel out of control, who feel threatened on a psychological level, and choose to simply do as little as possible and stay away from risk, which is, of course, I think, very undesirable, because for organizations, we think about SME, smaller entrepreneurs, but also the corporates. Risk taking is part of organizational life, and it's being, it's part of staying viable. And I think here again, right, it's instead of avoiding the challenges in life, it's better to face them and organize yourself around them. Make sure you understand them as much as possible. Organize support and face them head on instead of avoiding, because you're on a road to nowhere, I would say.
Yes, it's like a pendulum effect, right? When you're over cautious, you have this side effect of a culture of avoidance, which is not the most constructive culture that you can get. So yes, I hear you. So here's another question. This is someone from the banking industry, or at least curious about the banking industries. Yeah. How do you see the evolution of behavioral risk in the banking industries and others? Can you see an increase or decrease in the attention on this topic?
Oh, there's an absolute increase, yes. And I think regulators have been driving that from the beginning, are still driving that, but I think the industry, the banks themselves, are picking it up as well. And as I say, I see multiple capabilities, or I see capabilities of multiple banks and financial institutions. So there's absolutely more and more focus and interest in this area, and I have to, and either it can be focusing, using behavioral science towards consumers, or it can be that it's more a behavioral risk approach, focusing on the employees in an organization, or also using behavioral science in order for employee engagement. I have to say, for me, I wish, I'm a little bit impatient in this regard, right? So for me, I wish we would be further in this maturity process. If I look at 12 years back and everything that we found out along the way, if we look at a couple of examples of Credit Suisse and the SVB Bank, yeah, then I think there was absolutely more value that we could have gained if we did more in this area. But we have come a long way already.
I love that you say there's an increase, because I think all the insights and the body of knowledge that you spearheaded, I mean, really large kudos to you and your team for this pioneer effort. I think it's exportable, because the common denominator is human behavior, regardless of industry, right? The mindsets, the beliefs, that's universal in nature, right? It's just manifested in different ways in different industries, different verticals. But yes, I think it's exportable, and proof of that is how we're gaining some, curiosity and calls and people asking for your expertise from all sorts of industries, not just the financial industry, which is absolutely fantastic. Okay, so one last one. We only have time for one last, folks. I'm so sorry, but you're going to get a survey after this asking about your satisfaction with the webinar. If you have any topic that you'd like us to cover in future webinars, please write it there. Let us know. We'd welcome your feedback. So last, in the less than 4 minutes that we have left, trust and transparency are essential in every aspect of the business realm. But in the context of behavioral risk management, my inference is that these are especially relevant. trust and transparency. How can organizations cultivate them?
I think they're, they are very closely related and depending on each other. So, if I make it concrete in how I am used to doing these behavioral risk assessments, right? Which I think we have to realize that if you want people to open up and tell you the stories on what it's really like in an organization and tell you about the sharks they see swimming on that dark side, they have to trust you, right? And they have to be able to trust that you will handle their information in a confident way, and you will not hurt them with that information. So I think it's very important to first of all realize how reliant we are on other people and how important it is that we have trust. And by being transparent on what it is that you do and what you're aiming for, I think is a very important condition to start building that trust. So when you're doing a behavioral risk assessment, it is very important to be very open on, we're going to ask questions about this, how you make decisions and how you lead and how you communicate. We also want to find out about, the darker side of the organization, so what is not going well. And so be open about what it is, and then also be open about the process, right? So there's transparency on content, transparency on the process. Be very clear that you're not there to hunt for individuals, but you want to understand the patterns in the culture in an organization. I think trust and transparency are incredibly important. And what I said right earlier on, that we can how the people at the work for are so incredibly supportive of behavior risk assessment. I think it's because it taps into that transparency and they trust you, right? Because you don't talk, I'm looking for a word which I can use, right, on a webinar, but they trust you to be, they think you're bringing the real stuff. This is honest, right? People want honesty. And being transparent is so incredibly important that people will start to trust, and that you're able to build trust. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mirea. It was, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it too. If you're watching this recording, thank you so much for being there. More to come. Everybody, have a great rest of your days wherever you may be. And please give us feedback. What else would you like to listen to? And all right, until the next time, we're signing off. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Anabel. Thank you, everybody.